Pro talk about this system.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's pretty good. Marjorie, welcome.
Thank you.
It's really good to finally have you. Yeah.
Yeah.
We were talking about the advantages and disadvantages of milling your own flour. If you could scoot your microphone basically to the edge of the table.
Well, I'll actually improve my posture and.
Oh, even better.
Yeah.
Just angle it up just slightly. Yeah, there you go. Perfect. Yeah. Yeah, we're listening to your wisdom about flour.
So, well, the conversation was like striving to get your food as real as you can.
Mm.
And so, yeah, it is sort of like unpeeling the layers of everything that we eat. We live in this sort of like very weird time where our food comes from all around the world. It comes in these packaged forms, but also like it's so much is driven by logistics. Like what can you store, then what can you sell, and that's so like not how human beings have interacted with their food for like most of human history in terms of what it like the finished product, like what you're getting. Anyway, so hence why the desire for freshly milled flour. So freshly milled flour has 40 of the 44 essential amino acids, nutrients. So it's super healthy for you, right? We tend to think of like, oh, bread is not good for you. So like, if you can transition, like, okay, this is like a normal thing that I want to eat to something that's healthy, then like that seems like a win. But freshly milled flour, I think, is one of those things where, you know, another thing that we've sort of lost, it seems to me, over the recent generations is just generational wisdom and generational knowledge. And I think like food is a big area. I don't think America is weird in that way because we don't have a food culture. Like Italians really have a food culture. The French really have a food culture. The Indians have this like very robust food culture.
Okay.
But like we as Americans like don't have the sense of like this is like
this is how food ought to be prepared, ought to be
just
made in the kitchen, or like the way it should be prepared even before it arrives in our home.
Like, I think both.
Both.
Very much both. And I actually think like how it works in your home makes you more concerned with how it's produced. Like when the whole like, you know, fake meat came, it was very quick for Italy to be like, no, we're not doing that here. And I just think like having been to Italy, I'm like, oh yeah, that makes sense because you guys have a real food culture. And you care about like there's also like more cultural value in like the way you gather and have meals. So my sister, after college, she went and taught in France and, you know, teaching English to French students for a year. And my mom and I went to visit her. And while we were there, the students like organized this raclette meal. You guys heard of raclette? It's like, French, it's like a fondue kind of, but like with cheese. So it's like this like really delicious French cheese, and then you have like all these things with your raclette. So like,
like the cheese is melted and sort of bubbling over the. I've had it.
Yeah.
I was in Paris a few years ago. We had it with duck meat, and it was fantastic.
The confit de canard was like my favorite.
Oh,
like the
how do you pronounce that? Confit
de canard.
Du canard.
I'm pronouncing it horribly. No French person would ever rook that. But it's duck meat. It's been stored in duck fat. Anyway, it's unbelievably delicious. But anyway, something like that.
I was expecting to go to Paris and be a little bit down in the mouth about the food. Like, my expectation was, oh, it's been so vaunted for so long. Surely they're exaggerating. Yeah. And then I went to France and I was wrong. I was wrong. Yes. I thought they were not exaggerating, and I want to stay here forever.
Yes. I had the same experience.
Okay.
And yeah, but then later I went to Italy, and then like years after that, I went to India, and like talk about like very different cuisine, especially India to the European, but like Italians and like French, like the French food is like so wild to me because like everything feels like something that's very simple, but it's so well prepared. It's so unbelievably delicious.
Mm-hmm.
And like
the Italians, it's like a little bit more complex. They have like their own kind of style, but and like India is like totally different. Everything tastes like curry, everything's super spicy. It's like very intense. And like after coming back to America, I was like, everything is tastes so bland. Um, but just having that experience of like there so much has gone into like the iteration of the food that you're experiencing now. It's like generations and generations upon generations have created what that culture is experiencing now, and it's of great value to that culture. And I just think like, I mean, there's just like I don't think there's really an equivalent in America in terms of food culture. Sort of like we've borrowed a little bit, but even that, I was like in high school, in when I was a little kid, I refused to eat pasta. Then when I went to Rome and I was like, oh, this is what pasta is. Like, we don't eat this in America. Like, the thing that we say is pasta is like not even close to like what this like whole body of people are eating.
Yeah, we had to call it noodles.
There you go. Yeah. More appropriate.
So yeah.
I had no objection to eating noodles growing up as a kid. Yeah.
Well, it's sort of like one of those foods you like don't really think about. So
Oh, I
very-
spent
my mother was
a
very
lot of time
confused.
thinking about pasta.
and by that,
Oh, yeah.
it's like you just like obviously you give it to kids because obviously they like it.
Yes.
So my mother was very confused why I objected to it.
So in America, we have apple pie, we have burgers. Is that kind of it?
Well, we have Southern barbecue.
We have Southern barbecue. Right. So subcultures inside of America certainly have their cuisine, right?
Yes, I
If
think
you go
that's
into the
very-
South, there is Southern cuisine. If you go to Louisiana, there's Cajun cuisine. And then obviously there's all sorts of cuisine that's been imported, right? Like you can go to Mexican restaurants, Nepalese restaurants, right? So you can go and get culturally authentic food in America. But I think you're right.
I guess what I don't mean to say is like I don't mean food is not good in America. I mean like we as Americans don't have a whole cultural attachment to a mode of like eating and preparing food.
Okay.
Of like subcultures definitely do.
Yep. Yeah.
But like we as a whole people don't, and I kind of wonder sometimes if that has like informed our food system.
Right.
Yeah, it's like more. I think every American has the same feeling that you eat pizza and burgers on movie nights, popcorn.
Yeah.
That's like America to a T, you know?
Yeah.
We have McDonald's.
Yeah. I think that proves my point.
Right. We do in fact have a shared food experience, and that's fast food.
Yeah. And yes. Yeah. As a nation.
Yes.
Yes. Yeah.
Yes.
And like
There's a reason you could
and
write the
that's-
book,
those
Fast Food Nation.
exist in other countries, and that's what they experience as American cuisine too,
Mhm.
which is why we have kind of like the
Ah.
low level of the totem pole in terms of international recognition on our food quality.
Mm.
Yeah, it's a bit painful.
But that is true. You don't go to Italy and say, let's go find an American restaurant.
I
You
think
might-
some Americans do. I mean, I
but
had the
there's-
experience of being in France and the waiters and waitresses like, oh, these stupid Americans, like.
Hmm.
And well, it was just funny actually because when we arrived in Paris, like the next day we went to a restaurant and there was a loud American in there being like, I just want a hamburger.
Oh no. Oh no. It's
I
true.
think Americans kind of like we are okay with that. We're okay with that sort of presentation abroad. Well,
Of ourselves
being
being loud.
the broad we, and just being like, this is my thing. Like, I don't care if you don't like it. Like,
Mm,
I'm okay with that.
right. It's not right. You people have it on the menu for a reason. Yeah.
Yeah.
There's a reason I need to point. Right. There's a reason I can point at a hamburger on the menu and then butcher me asking for it. Interesting. I do remember being very frustrated with my buddy when we were in Israel and we had this unbelievable Mediterranean spread in front of us, and he ordered an American cheeseburger.
What?
And I remember looking at him and saying, we came halfway around the world and you still want your burger? He said, yeah, I'm here to see the sights, not explore whatever it is they tell me is edible. I have no idea if that's edible. I said, it's an olive, eat it. It's edible. Yeah. Oh, it was something else.
Yeah. That's a little bit
Because then 2 years later, we were like in France and the same thing happened. And then we were down in Argentina. Like it's consistent.
And I believe
Yeah,
that. And
yeah.
I think that's, yeah, I don't know. I guess it's probably not worthwhile making generalizations about that.
I do think it is interesting that there is not a identifiable American cuisine, right? You could grow up in New York City and never share the same diet as someone who grows up in West Texas,
Mm-hmm.
unless you go to Buffalo Wild Wings and McDonald's and Burger King or Hooters or like any number of things, right? Like unless you're going to those places, you're not going to eat the same things.
Yeah. And I mean, like, I don't know. I don't know if that's like, that is just the way that it is because we're a very new country and because we're a very huge country. Um, but I do think now in sort of the age that we're in, right, post-industrial age of like, now we like get our food from grocery stores instead of like growing it and getting from a farmer, which is how you would typically get it. That like that informs our expectation from grocery stores. I guess is like my whole like very backwards point about this whole thing.
Mm.
Is that because you don't have a really long standing heritage when it comes to food, how you prepare your food in your home, and what that means for you culturally, then you're more willing to sort of accept food as it is. And right, part of the system now too, and like I think some of the things that have led the food system to be the way that it is sort of post World War II. Okay, actually, like many nations are in a food crisis right now. We need to produce food. It needs to be shelf stable food. So driven by very, very practical ends.
Mhm.
But then you sort of, okay, now I have this system of like producing food on this very large scale. And now I can produce agribusiness dollars to export this food to other places. And my drive for food production is not quality. I don't actually care about like the nutrient quality of my food. What I care about is being able to produce it as cheaply as possible and have it sort of be as stable as possible. So like a lot of the things that sort of now with like the Maha movement people are uncomfortable with are either preservatives or things like food dyes, which is like, or like food dyes or like MSG, things that are going to make your food, sort of like added sugar is another example, like things that are going to make your food more addictive and going to be more marketable.
Mm.
Like, Fruit Loops in the
Yes.
United States, right? You might have heard of that. This is like a big Maha thing lately of like, Kellogg's produces Fruit Loops in like Canada and Europe that are colored with natural food. So like, the red are colored by beets and like whatever. I think they use like carrots for the orange color, but they use synthetic dyes in the United States. And they just say, well, it's because it's more marketable because kids like the brighter colors better. And like now it's like sort of
Our
like,
Fruit Loops are better Fruit Loops than your Fruit Loops. Yeah.
and we're literally producing a healthier version for the rest of the world.
Yeah.
And you have to eat the crappy version because it's like more
It's more exciting to
exciting.
have Red 40
Yeah.
than beet juice.
Yes. And it is brighter.
It is brighter.
Yes.
A friend once asked me for diet advice, and I did say to him, if your food has a mascot, don't eat it.
Oh, that's very good advice.
That's really good.
Yeah, it was funny. He said, I don't have a ton of time to start thinking about the ins and outs and the type of oil and whether something is cold pressed and
Yeah.
whether something is organic or not. And is it organic or is it 100% organic? He's like, I know that I won't spend that much time on it. So give me two pieces of advice. I said, okay, shop on the rim of the grocery store.
Smart.
And if it has a mascot, cheer for it, but don't eat it.
Sure for it. Not crackle pop.
Tony the Tiger.
Yeah.
Tony the Tiger ain't rooting for you, so don't root for him.
Stay away from Wheaties. They make you.
Mm.
Did you see that?
No.
So Bruce Jenner, when he was Olympian, was on Wheaties, and then when he came out as Caitlyn Jenner, he was also on Wheaties. And then the joke was like, "Don't eat Wheaties. They don't make you champion. They make you trans."
More effective than atrazine.
Yeah. Right. The breakfast of whom? Yeah. Yeah. Wow.
Kind of funny.
So Maha, is
Make America Healthy Again.
Make America Healthy Again.
Yeah,
Okay.
so that's like, so when RFK and Trump joined forces in the grand movement that stirred the hearts of many a mother like me, so he kind of adopted the MAGA thing, but he took it as Make America Healthy Again. So that's like the big slogan for our little subculture community who that like wants like feeding your family well to not just be this like unbelievably complicated process of like, yeah, so like simply like processed versus like not processed. Great. Okay, then so then you're gonna eat the not processed stuff, or like what has that been sprayed with? Like
Sure.
I don't know. And then like, oh, if I am gonna eat something out of a box, like how do I evaluate this like incredibly complicated list of ingredients to say like, yeah, that's fine or that's not okay. It's way too complicated to just eat healthy in America. And the amount of additives that are legal here outstrip literally every country in the rest of the world by hundreds.
Okay. The things that can be put on food in America is would
Essentially, it's innocent until it's proven guilty
okay.
in
And-
terms of the regulations, like FDA regulations,
Gotcha.
is my understanding.
And the rest of the world has a bit of a reverse approach of don't put it in yourself until you understand what it is and what it does. Interesting.
Did you see actually today, RFK is working on putting something through to keep 10,000 ingredients out of food that he's seen as like unhealthy. Can you imagine 10,000?
That's the thing
It's
is like how many of
These
this-
are
Yeah.
different types of acids for preservative purposes, different types of
Yeah.
dyes to make food more exciting.
Things,
These are not, it's not like, oh, no more cranberries. It's like
Yeah.
what is being sprayed onto, added to
It's all the stuff you can't pronounce on the back of the
all
bottle.
the stuff that I can't
I was
pronounce.
gonna say, go in, you'll have a good time. Go in the grocery store and then like have your like 10,000 like lined paper.
Yep.
And then try to fill in each line. It's like it's not that hard to like get very, very far with things like you're like pick up something, you're like, there are like 45 things on here. Like, how are there 45 things on here?
Sure.
Do you know John Gassner?
Mm-mm.
Okay, he's a classmate of mine, but he's running his own bread company out of Virginia,
Mhm.
and he had this great line for me. He's like, "If the ingredient list is longer than your intestinal tract, don't eat it." I was like,
That's very good.
I guess it is difficult because you could even today shop fairly conscientiously and be like, okay, I'm going to buy apples and red peppers, but then you discover that the apple you're eating is actually a genetic hybrid of 3 other fruits, and they're grown so fast that they don't have the nutrient value that a ancestral apple would have had. And then the red pepper that you're eating has been sprayed with so many toxins that it might be giving you cancer. It's tough to say.
Exactly. Yes, it's very tough to say. And also it's tough to say and nobody seems to care of like what are the sources? Like why are autism rates skyrocketing so intensely? 1 in 36? Like that is that's an insane percentage jump and it's expected to continue on that trajectory. And people will say like, well, we don't know what causes autism. So you're like, okay, but like somebody like trying to find out, like this is like kind of a big deal. Cancer rates, same thing of like we're on a terrifying trajectory in terms of like higher statistical incidence, and yet I think like the typical thing is like, well, we don't really know, and that's not the kinds. Those are not the kinds of questions Western medicine seems interested in asking. It's like, oh, you have a problem, and this is like kind of a broader sweeping problem of like, did you guys listen to or have you heard of Kelly and Casey Means?
I've heard of him.
They made a bit of a splash before. kind of in
Wait,
that
she's the
era.
doctor. He's the former pharmaceutical rep.
Yes.
Yes. I've listened to an interview with them.
Yeah.
Man, talk about 2 kids who can make you not sleep at night.
Yes, definitely. One of the things I thought she pointed out that I thought was very interesting is our sort of research, the way we think of research as being like the gold standard, right, is a double-blind, placebo-controlled studies. And she kind of made the point, which I thought was really wise, that that allows you to isolate one thing and really like the point is for it to isolate all the controls around one thing and see like, is this one thing making an effect one way or the other? But if that's your only way of evaluating, like, can I know something scientifically about this thing? Well, have you done double-blind, placebo-controlled study on it? If you haven't, we actually don't know anything. And like that instinct of like, well, you don't know anything, like actually, it is so difficult to control something in your environment to that point to where you can then like know specifically about that thing. But does that mean you're like literally not going to make any judgments about like our very complex world? Sort of saying like something pretty big seems to be going wrong since like people are getting cancer at extremely high rates. People are getting diabetes at extremely high rates. 70% of America's youth doesn't qualify for the military.
I did hear that recently.
Like that is totally mind blowing. And like, are we asking the questions of like, whoa, on a global scale, this isn't working. Something really seems to be going wrong. Like, do we then say, okay, well, I don't know what's going wrong. We're going to have to do double blind placebo controlled studies on every single variable until we figure out what's going wrong? Like,
Oh, interesting.
or are we actually going to use our prudence and wisdom to be able to see in broad sweeps, like, anyway, and not to say that's not a good standard for some kinds of knowledge, but like, is that the only way we gain knowledge? That seems to be really limiting.
Wow. That
And very costly too.
right. Giesting was on here saying, what does it take to run an MME, a million mouse study? It's like that takes an enormous amount of funding. So
Yeah.
you're trying to run an experiment that is demonstrating something pretty concrete. Yes, that is good that you are trying to do that. The number of such experiments that you can actually run is limited by both time and funding availability.
Right. And sort of in the meantime is like, well, do we have human knowledge and wisdom and prudence? Like,
Oh, interesting.
has that sort of just like gone out the window? And they're like, well, we can't know it because we can't know it in this very specific.
Have you run a study that indicates what you're saying? It's like, no, this is sort of the collected instinct of my great grandmother and my grandmother and my mother and me. Like, this is a collective instinct we have. Well, that is the fuzziest thinking I can imagine. So shove it, you know?
Yeah.
I mean, yeah, like they use Coca-Cola to clean up blood spills on dry highways. You know, it's like,
That's wild. I did not know
you
that.
know, so it's like that's not that good.
Like, great.
Yeah.
That's wild.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I wonder if you could do just like, you know how they have like sample testing like for like especially in the fitness world, they'll do like give these people so much of this supplement, these people so much of that supplement, see what their results are at the end. Pretty simple. So I feel like you could do that with a lot of things like this person eats Doritos and this person eats something else, you know, and like how do they feel afterwards? You could just start going based by feel almost of like, do you feel better or worse after this food? And then kind of, I don't know.
I think you could do that, but I honestly think like to me, I feel like well there's either maybe this is getting a little meta. There's either like like belief in like creation in the fallen world, or you believe in like the progressive narrative and like man's conquering of nature. And I really think like that seems to me to kind of be what your assumptions come down to. So I'm like, okay, well, you could do stuff like that, but like I don't really feel a great need to do that. I probably just need to do my best to get my food closer to the way it is in creation, and also to know that like I'm not going to eliminate human disease. I'm not going to eliminate human vulnerability. I'm not going to expect my kids never to be sick. It's like I actually think there's kind of a piece of the health world that's like actually striving for that. Which maybe that's a little.
You're saying there's a piece of the health world that is aiming at freedom from biological boundaries of any kind.
Yeah. Have you heard of the guy Dave Asprey and they're sort of like the biohackers movement?
Oh, the guy who wants to live forever through. Yes, I have heard of him. I've read some articles about him.
And I can't remember there's a name of another guy.
Ryan Johnson.
Maybe it's that. Oh,
And
yeah.
I mean, shouldn't somebody be doing this?
Well, I kind of think like that's what they're doing, and they're like a very obvious iteration of like I'm trying to live forever, literally through like whatever hacking my body.
Mhm.
But I also think like, well, there's something in the health world of like I actually just need to eliminate all of the toxins of any of the food my family is consuming, and that will make us well, and that will make us like resilient. And I'm sort of like, well, yeah, but like the world is fallen. Like you sort of have to do the best you can with what you have.
Mhm.
And I think with like a mother's fear particularly is very much like I don't have control over these things, but like I actually have to make a decision every day about what I give my children. So like I am in a sense have this like great sense of agency. So I
Right.
very
You
much
have to sort of
understand.
you have to sort of decide on your own degree of zealotry.
Yeah, and I think it's like it's a bit of a false thing to chase after because like no matter what you do, you're not going to eliminate human vulnerability because like that's part of creation and like part of living in a fallen world. So,
So what's your
I don't know
paradigm when
why
it
I got
comes?
that.
Well, no, this is really interesting. So what is your paradigm, right? Because you're probably facing these daily decisions of what to feed your family,
Mhm.
but at the same time, you are probably given any number of opportunities to be even more of a zealot.
Definitely. And I think like slowly over time, I've been like, okay, I've eliminated X thing from our like our daily like lives in terms of what we consume. I've eliminated X thing, but like there's just like there's like people who are like peanut butter is really bad for you because it has mold in it and contains aflatoxins. And I'm like, listen, like we're pretty much eating like all organic stuff. We're eating like local beef, our own eggs, raw milk, like freshly milled flour bread. Like think we're gonna do okay with a little bit of peanut butter. Um, and
We
so
got rid of the fluff, okay? Leave us alone.
so I'm right. There's like for me, there like definitely been like stages of like getting to where we are with food, and like I don't know, just like there's a specter that you can chase after of like there's a toxin in that, it's poisonous, it's gonna like anyway do bad things to me and my family.
Sure. I remember having a bit of a moment about that when someone challenged me about tomatoes. Tomatoes, they're a nightshade.
Nightshade.
They
Yeah.
cause inflammation.
Some people think that.
You shouldn't eat tomatoes.
And I just think like tomatoes exist in creation. People have been eating them for a long time. I think it's probably okay. Sorry.
I kind of had the same reaction. Now, all right, here's maybe my future self will be back and be like, thank God I got off those little information berries. Inflammation. Yeah.
They're red for a reason.
Yeah. The poison grapes of North America. I don't know. But I just remember thinking, wait a minute, you got me off the Krispy Kremes. Like, yes, obviously that was a good idea.
Yeah.
But now you're going after artichoke hearts, olive oil, the nightshade family. Ugh, like when does it stop?
And you know what also grates me is like carbs are bad for you. So bread is bad for you, rice is bad for you, potatoes are bad for you. That is literally the food of the poor. That's what the poor people have been surviving on since for so many hundreds of years.
Mm-hmm.
And like that to me is like really God created the world such that poor people couldn't be healthy until the 21st century. Like and in like maybe even not now because like now all of our food is full of processed stuff. Like that to me is like, oh, I can't I can't handle that. Like, that doesn't
Right.
sit with me.
At the same time, our wheat and our rice have been stripped of some of their historical nutrient.
Oh, no, I absolutely agree with that. Like, what is it like in creation when we don't adulterate it with all kinds of junk? I completely agree with that. But like, is it de facto bad for you? Or is it bad for you in its bastardized form?
Mm-hmm.
Well, it's interesting you mentioned carbohydrates because there's a guy I follow who's kind of like the leading voice and like understanding how to build strength and muscle. His
Mhm.
name's Dr. Andy Galpin, and he said that carbs are more important than protein.
Whoa, that is a dissonant voice in the
Yeah.
right now.
Yeah, run that by me one more.
So he was saying that your body, so carbohydrate is hydrated carbon. He said your body is primarily carbon based. So he said your body needs carbon to keep functioning.
Mm.
So he said carbon is your fuel source. said protein is your building material. So he said like you can build with protein, but your body needs some sort of carbs to have fuel to actually build what's there. So it's kind of like carbs are your fuel, and then yeah, like protein's your metal. So it's like, what are you gonna frame up with what you got,
Yeah.
you know? Pretty interesting. So he was
That's very
recommending
cool.
more carbs for people than protein, actually.
Wild.
In
Because
what form?
Um, he didn't
Like
say.
lots of fruits or
I think it doesn't matter.
grains?
I think grains, fruits. Yeah, I think as long as you stay out of like carbs that are mixed with a lot of other stuff. So like people think carbs and beer are what make you fat. It's not that. It's beer actually has an inhibitor on testosterone.
Mm-hmm.
So when you drink beer, your body stops producing it and then produces more estrogen.
And so many of all of like all of the like seed oils act like xenoestrogens in the body.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
That's interesting.
Yeah. There's is like
What does bourbon do?
Bourbon makes you strong
Okay.
because in the Civil War, that's what guys drank when they didn't have water. Did you know about that? So in the Civil War, the soldiers were given a ration of a pint of whiskey a day as their
A
a
pint?
pint?
a pint a day was their
Dang,
payment.
distilleries are doing good then.
Yeah, and then so a lot of times they didn't have clean water where they were, so they would drink their whiskey for hydration.
Would they mix? Were they mixing it into the water in hope of like purifying or sterilizing it?
I'm
You
not
know?
sure. They use it for sterilizing wounds a lot, but
Mhm.
I don't know about the water.
Hmm.
But 120 degrees in Georgia with wool uniforms hauling cannons up a mountain drinking whiskey. Seems to work. I'm a,
Not all the shots landed on target.
yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't
Wow.
know. I think whiskey is pretty good. Hard alcohol is usually better than non-hard,
Mhm.
actually, for health, which is interesting.
Very interesting. Marjorie, I'm curious if you had a moment that set you on the path of trying to rethink your food.
Mm. Um, a moment. No, I wouldn't say. I would say so. Background wise, when I was living in Texas, so I'll snake horses into this conversation
Right.
via this conversation. So I grew up riding, really loved horses, and went to UD as an undergrad, had a great experience there. WCC opened a year after I went to college, so it wasn't my fault. Um, Later got back into horses and ended up doing equine therapy. And part of the reason for that, I spent when I was in India, I volunteered with the MCs and I worked with people with special needs while I was there and I really loved that. And so I ended up getting into equine therapy. And when you're sort of like intertwined with the special needs community, you sort of have the sort of real like sense of gravitas. That like a lot of people are children, a lot of people and their families and their children are dealing with these really debilitating diseases that they don't know where or how.
Okay.
And there's some sort of like some things are like, okay, that's clearly genetic. But then there are a lot of things that are much more gray area, like autism. I don't know if you guys know this. The diagnosis autism is the name for a set of symptoms. It's not identifiable in another way. So I think
There's no genetic marker for it.
correct.
Like, oh, take a blood sample. Oh, he's got it.
Exactly. It's literally and it's kind of set aside, at least this is my understanding of like whatever 10 years ago. In the diagnostic manual is like, this is a little bit different because we actually just have a name for a number of these symptoms. And like if they fall under this, and that's why it's called autism spectrum disorder, or it was ASD. And I think that kind of planted the seed for me of like, I guess, I don't know, maybe some people are more at peace with this, but like, of like, wow, there are a lot of variables that I like don't know and can't control, but I can see how for certain people they've had really living with things that are very, very challenging and seem unnatural, even I would say like that's sort of fair. Now, like I would say the other like really beautiful thing about working with the special needs community is you see sort of like the way God works through so many people with special needs. And like there's sort of a lot of simplicity and beauty and sort of authenticity that like we in our sort of more complicated way of living don't have. So I will say I like really, really loved that experience. But I think as a mother, and I think I kind of mentioned this before of like, you're like, okay, I don't know all the variables, but I am an agent. And like, I am kind of the agent for these people who are depending on me. And so how do I care for them the best that I can? And when your kids are little, like a lot of it is like nourishing their bodies. And so like, okay, how do I nourish my child's body the best that I can? Um, and that kind of, I think, was sort of like the seed. And then I think there's really been a movement sort of with like a little bit sort of like the medical skeptical crowd and then sort of like the food skeptical crowd of like, oh, there's like a lot of stuff. And then again, those are kind of both manifesting in the Maha movement. And so I was like sort of like online, like in touch with those groups of people. But again, kind of had that disposition of like, oh yeah, I know these specters are kind of out there and they really can manifest in very really big ways. Yeah, so I would say that's sort of like the slow trajectory. And then to me, I think, how do I evaluate what's good? Is it as close to its form as it was intended to be in creation?
Okay.
Like that just seems like a very sort of basic litmus test to me. Of like, all right, well, if people have been eating this way for millennia, probably it's a good idea.
It's sort of
I don't
past the performance test.
Yeah, I don't buy into the notion that like, oh, we did this study, X, Y, or Z thing does X thing, and therefore it's bad for you now. Are you guys familiar with Weston A. Price?
Oh yeah.
Yeah. So right, dentist in I think like the mid 1900s goes to study all of these indigenous cultures that have not been touched or like not been conformed to the Western diet. People have great teeth, they don't get cavities. They don't have all of the diseases that we have in the West, like cancer, heart disease, cardiovascular disease. I don't know, maybe that's the same thing. And like sort of just like looking at the diets. Now, some of these people are like live in really remote locations, and that's what has allowed them to not be touched by the Western diet. So I think there's some amount of like, okay, prudential human wisdom. Like I probably don't.
McDonald's wasn't flying in doing airdrops of McFlurries.
Like
People gotta know.
Like to be healthy, I probably don't need to live like an Inuit because I don't live in like this extreme Alaskan climate. Like it's probably okay if I don't do the same thing as those people. But like so he tried to find vegans and he like just couldn't find he really like wanted to find a culture that like didn't have any animal products in their diets and he just couldn't find one. Which I think is like also telling of like, oh, interesting. Like, okay, this sort of idea that we have now of like the vegan diet, the vegetarian diet is somehow cleaner or more kind to the environment or and healthier. I mean, I think that's like one like group of people, but it's, I don't know, fairly mainstream that we kind of have those basic assumptions like, oh, good, like your kids, in order for them to be healthy, they really need to eat their vegetables. That's kind of like, those are sort of like the some sort of basic assumptions. And not just, I'm not an anti-vegetable person. Those people exist too.
No vegetables.
Yeah, the carnivore diet is like definitely like really taken hold in like certain areas. Dr. Paul Saladino is like very, very anti-vegetable because of like oxalates and like, plants protect themselves. So if you're gonna eat them, you're gonna get their bad chemicals too. Sorry. Clearly I'm like plugged into this.
And you're on the
Thanks, Tom.
Yeah, Tom's nodding along. They're like, yeah, you're speaking my language.
But to me, again, my litmus
Jonathan's
test
sitting here
is
with a
like,
blank look on his
what's
face.
creation like? And what have we been doing for most of human history? So if I'm going to make a real pivot to like horses and the value of horses, up until about 150 years ago, Industrial Revolution, like human beings, well, okay, so we were eating a certain way, right? We were also in contact, in meaningful goal-oriented contact with animals, like from the dawn of time to about 150 years ago, right? Agriculture, you wanted to develop your land, you wanted to eat food, you had to have meaningful contact with animals in order to do that, whether you're eating vegetables or whether you're killing animals in order to like slaughter them and eat them, right? Warfare, that's another like example of like, okay, you use animals to like fight other people's, like to protect yourself, but also maybe to conquer. But transportation, which is like kind of like your most universal. Even if you're not growing the food, you're gonna like go to a farmer, like buy the food. You're gonna probably be using animals to do that,
Sure.
right? Whether that be, well, whatever beast of burden is your choice.
Yep.
And so like even there, like, okay, well, clearly God thought it was a good idea for that to be the case. If that's like how we've spent most of human history. Okay, like eating real things and being in contact with animals was probably a good thing. Like what we're doing now is really wildly unique in the perspective of human history. And one of the ways I
That
think
you could grow up to be an adult, potentially with having never really had contact with animals.
and I would say specifically meaningful goal-oriented contact with animals,
Okay.
because like we still have like cats and dogs, but like you meet a dog who's like pretty well behaved. Like what's the baseline standard for well-behaved dogs in America?
Oh, come if. Oh, wait. What's the standard? Oh, housebroken.
What's the baseline? Yeah.
Yeah, housebroken.
Yeah. Or like maybe you can sit, like maybe you can lay down. Like that's a pretty good dog. It sits and lays down. It comes. Ooh, that's a good dog. Our standards
Oh,
are
if a dog
very-
comes when you call it, people think you must be a dog whisperer. Yeah. Yeah. People are like, oh, you.
if it rolls over when you go bang bang,
Yeah.
and you're like, you're primo.
You're Cesar Milan. Yeah.
But that I just want to say, like, that is so unique to human history. Like and I know, so cats are the other one. Cats, I would say, is like the much more constant because like I don't think they were training cats 400 years ago.
Yeah, they have that mind of their own.
But cats had have a utility, right? They like control your rodent population. They're pretty effective at doing that. But you're not together collaborating with the cat to like get that job done. But you are collaborating with the oxen to plow your field. You are collaborating with a horse to draw your carriage or to get you across town. And you're collaborating with your dog to like, even if it's like fox hunting, like you're collaborating with your hounds to like go chase the fox. I mean, that's like a aristocratic example, but I sort of mean like across class, I think like people are having meaningful, goal-oriented
That's an
contact
interesting
with
angle
animals.
to it. Right.
Yeah,
So this is not just about having animals nearby.
exactly.
It's animals with a job to do.
Yeah, and I think that's it. I think of this example, I think of that distinction a lot at WCC because, right, we say one of our goals is contact with God's first book, which is such a beautiful, unique, and wonderful thing that I think WCC has to offer. But I think it's really different when you're out in the wilderness and you're like encountering nature in that way. That's really different than collaborating with animate nature. And I'm not saying one is better than the other. I'm just saying they actually just teach you really different things and they speak to you in really different ways. But I think both are pieces of God's first book. So this gal, Vicki Hearn, wrote a book called Adam's Task, Calling the Animals by Name. And in this book, she says, when we fell, our relationship with the creation was broken. And right, there's a great tragedy in that. But dogs and horses said, I'll give you one more chance. Which I just think is such a beautiful way of encapsulating that like we have with these two particular animals and like kind of all of the animal kingdom, there's a long tradition of humans having like really meaningful relationships and like collaborative relationships with those animals.
Right. And those are the animals that people will say there's something like a friendship there.
Yes.
Right. I don't know what's going on with cats. Maybe that's like a addict codependent relationship. They're addicted. I don't know. Cats, yeah, cats, that mystifies me. But certainly with dogs and horses, right? Alois Podolsky wrote the book, My Horses, My Teachers, right? We have a way of putting human we can describe horses and dogs as having something like a human relationship with us in a way that we wouldn't say about the oxen that plows our field.
Yes. Yeah, exactly. And that's the thing is like yeah, there's something really distinctive about those two kinds of animals, their capacity for entering into meaningful relationship. I think is really unique. Pablo's had a tutor at St. John's who wrote a book, Willing Dogs, Reluctant Masters was the title of it.
Oh,
And he talked about like Aristotle's notion of unequal friendship and how dogs participate in this. And the thing that allows them to participate in this is because they understand justice. And I thought like,
Whoa.
this is
yeah. Say more.
which I was gonna say. So I'm gonna table that because I'm
No.
cruel.
You got to explain.
But you kind of understand, like a dog understands, like when it's done the wrong thing, when you like come home after a long day and the dog like got into the trash, like that dog is probably gonna be like slinking around, like, oh no,
Yeah.
I did it. Like, I couldn't help myself. Um,
Okay.
and so in that, it's like
It's interesting.
the dog has an understanding of justice, of like I transgressed. Like,
Right.
a dog has the capacity to like understand that, and that's what opens their soul up to being able to be in that sort of category of friendship, of unequal friendship. I mean, unequal relationship. And that just means like a student to a teacher, I think, would fall in that same kind of category, of not like of equal worth, but of like the roles in the relationship. I'm not my husband, so I won't be able to articulate that as well.
It's okay.
But I think there's something very similar going on with horses, is like they have a real capacity for relationship. And in a way, yeah, that's very different than like a cow or a giraffe or, another large herd and prey animal. There's something different about horses and like you look throughout all of human history and like horses have played a really important part in so many cultures in so many instances over time. Right, the Bedouin tribes did not have the like cows sleeping in their tents. That was the place for the Arabian mares.
Interesting.
And like there's sort of like the most I think contemporary version of that are like the Mongolian tribes and their relationship to their horses still today. But so there's something going on there of like, okay, what sets the horse apart, and what has allowed it to play this like really profound place in human history for so long. So you probably heard that phrase, natural horsemanship. So what's your understanding of that?
So I basically just associate that with Pat Pirelli.
I noticed you had him in the like little question.
Yeah. So my association with that is trying to mimic the relationship between the dominant leader of a herd and the horse you're trying to train. I'm also associating it with certain tools used in the training, certain types of halters, little flag sticks.
Pirelli's super good at branding.
So what?
Pat Pirelli specifically is
Yes.
very, very good at branding.
Yes.
Marketing.
He's brilliant.
He's the pro marketer in the natural horsemanship world.
Right. Yes. I remember watching one of his DVDs as a kid and noticing the continuity errors. And I thought maybe I should be in filmmaking, not thinking about horses so much, because all the little continuity errors were jumping out at me in the filming. And they annoy me to this day. And it's been 20 years. So yeah.
Do you remember a specific example?
Oh yeah. So the whole conceit of this training video was this It's so cliched. Middle-aged woman with a horse that she loved it at first, but now they've been having some problems with communication. And so at her wit's end, she loads up Bucky into the trailer and off they go to Pat Pirelli's ranch to address the issues. I mean, so it's so cliched. But anyway, I remember very specifically they had some footage of her driving down the road to Pat Pirelli's ranch and turning right. And I remember the clouds in the background when she arrives for this week-long clinic with Pat, right? And the clouds had I remember the shape of the clouds. And then the rest of the DVD happens. So it's like another hour and a half of, oh, like we have to get your horse to be more eager to collect, or we have to get your horse to really understand the relationship of a dominant herd leader and a blah, 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 blah for an hour and a half. And then at the end, she's like, oh, and I'm so glad I came and see Pat Pirelli because he solved all my problems and everything's wonderful now. And then they show the truck and the trailer pulling out from the ranch, and it's the same cloud bank.
I'm really regretting my question. I was really hoping this would be like a more horse-oriented continuity issue.
No, it was the damn clouds, And I remember thinking they just rolled the footage at the same time to make it easier.
Those dirty, yeah.
Yeah, those dirty SOBs, lazy film crew. The film crew probably didn't even stick around for the whole week. Anyway,
Well, I'm just gonna like take control again. I'm just back.
forget the clouds, Jonathan.
I'm gonna backpedal a little bit, and I'm gonna put the car in reverse and go back to like, okay, remember when I said like up until 150 years ago we had meaningful goal-oriented contact with animals?
Yeah.
So what's replaced all of those things in our lives?
Mechanics?
The truck.
Yeah, technology. So either tools or I mean, I guess tools in sort of like a varying modes, but like not primitive tools. Most of it is like machines. Do you have to persuade a machine to like do what you want it to do?
Sometime. That's cold out, yeah.
So with machines, you have to know how it operates, and you have to be able to go through that formula of operation.
Yeah.
In order to get it to work. So there's definitely knowledge involved, and there's techne, right? There's like a skill involved in being able to operate. Like whatever it is that, like a car is like the basic one, right?
Sure.
That we all do every day.
The push button. Yeah.
But right, because so if it's working, great, like we're in business. If I know how to operate it, I have the like knowledge of how this thing works. I know the formula. I can operate. This thing can function under my.
I can sort of cast the spell.
Exactly. If it doesn't work, it's broken. And if it's broken, I need to fix it. Right? I don't have to persuade or have an understanding. I do not have to ask this thing to do it, and then it's going to do it. It's the perfect slave. Because it allows perfect submission of my will over it. Right? There's no element of rhetoric or persuasion or understanding beyond operational understanding involved. And again, like if there's something going wrong, maybe I'm operating it wrong. I guess that's the other like possibility. But it's either I'm operating it wrong or it's broken.
Yeah. Interesting. If my will cannot be carried out by it, it's broken. Interesting.
So my question, and like I think one of the things I ask our students is like, okay, what does that do to the human soul? Of like, okay, God thought it was good, right? And when you think about like being a farmer, man, you're like so subject to like the weather. My kids, like love the Laura Ingalls Wilder stories, and we've read them over and over again. And it's so wonderful, but it's so painful too, because they're whatever, the grasshoppers come, they like eat their whole crops. So an agrarian lifestyle is really tied to the vulnerability of the weather. Right. And you're sort of like, okay, like one of the cool things about civilizations throughout time, they like build next to water because water is like sort of assurance of abundance. And but there's no guarantee. And with animals, I think there's also a kind of vulnerability there because, right, you don't, and a lot of people approach horses now in this day and age, like we approach them like technology. And I would say that's true for horse culture and non-horse culture. Of like, okay, my middle-aged woman, she buys this horse and like, this was a good horsey at first, and now it's being a bad horsey, and I need to take it to this fancy guy
mechanic.
who can wave his wand
Hmm.
and give me these tricks so I can make it into a thing that functions again.
Mm-hmm.
So I would say
By functions, we mean do what I want it to do.
exactly. And I would say like, okay, so what's the goal of riding horses? Like when you get on a horse, like how do you want it to go?
Yeah, that's a good question because we don't really need it for we don't really need it for travel anymore. We can travel with it, but it's sort of it's a lark, right?
Yeah. A lot more efficient ways of traveling.
Sure.
And I will say, like, qualifiedly, I'm not saying I even enjoying the convenience of modern technology want to go back to the days where we like didn't have it.
Yeah.
But I do want to ask the question, what have we lost by doing?
Right.
What have we lost? And what can we like in what way can we sort of recultivate our like real connection with animate nature?
Mm-hmm.
And I'll have things to say about what I think it can offer us.
I guess when I ride, I've had two pretty distinct but both profound experiences from horseback, which one was, it seemed to me that being on horseback sort of added this like extra verve or spice to being out in the mountains. Like hiking's great, right? And you can get to the top of a hill and it's wonderful. But there's something about being there with the horse that for me has given it an extra spice. So there's something about like it enhances the beauty of the experience. But then there's the other branch of I've actually done some cattle pushes from horseback, and that really was amazing. And part of the amazing part was, oh my goodness, we're getting something done, right? We're getting a job done, and I remember that feeling very fulfilling. So that's the two things I've experienced, and I would say when I ride, like what's the goal? I would probably say I'm chasing one of those two things when I ride. Does that answer your question?
Well, kind of, yeah. And I should clarify, like, what's your expectation for the horse in those two scenarios?
I mean, for me, it's generally, I do expect the horse to do what I tell it.
Yeah.
But I also want the horse to have a good time.
Yeah. Right. So there's two sides to that of like, and I don't think, so I guess what I'm sort of pushing at is like, we want the horse to submit to our will. And I don't think that's a bad thing that we want that. I think there's something true to like the hierarchy of being that we like desire that. But I think the way it tends to manifest in a negative way is that like you're either a good horsey if you do what I want, or you're a bad horsey if you don't. And like the idea of natural horsemanship, like sort of at its fundamental, probably is like kind of a whole other kind of hilarious thing. But is understanding, how does the horse understand the world such that I can elicit this horse's get this horse's obedience in a way that like I'm entering into the way that they think about it. And spoiler alert, you learning the horse's language is much more effective than like you teaching a horse English. Probably you're surprised by that, but so the idea of natural horsemanship is that you enter into the mode in which the horse understands the world, and then you use that in order to get obedience from the horse. Like, but I guess what I'm saying is like we want the horse to submit to our will. Is that the highest goal? Or is there something higher?
Oh,
You mentioned like, but I want the horse to have a good time too.
yeah.
Right? We sort of innately sense that like I'm doing something, right? Cool, meaningful, goal oriented. Like cow work is like one of like the really actual, truly like relevant practical skills that the horse like still has today that like we haven't found like a great technological replacement for. So hopefully we don't, because it's one of the funnest things to do.
You're right.
Or like I'm doing something meaningful and goal oriented with the horse, and like this is so cool, and I want the horse to be able to like be enjoying it with me. And like when you're on a horse that's really like really cowy and like hooks onto that cow, it's like, oh my gosh, like this just became so much cooler than just me saying turn here, you're really obedient. It's like this just became this amazing thing that like we're doing together. And so like your sense of like both mastery but also unity
Mm-hmm.
is so much greater. So Xenophon says that a dancer does or a horse does nothing more beautiful under constraint than a dancer who is whipped and goaded. So the horse must make all which is most magnificent of his appearance of his own will with the help of aids.
Mm-hmm.
And I love going back to that because it's like Xenophon's perspective on the horse is so not a tool. Although like you need to be able to do things together with horses, right? He's a soldier and a warrior. You need the obedience from the horse, but like that's not the telos or the goal of horsemanship, right? It's for this like a unity of wills. Right. But if you assume a unity of wills, it also assumes that you're eliciting the choice of this horse to be with you in the way that like a ballerina dances a ballet.
Mm-hmm.
Right. Or if you're dancing together with some, right, there's always the person who's the leader. If you're, I don't know, you guys dance, right?
Sure. Okay.
Right?
So there has to be an inspiration in the other, right? You have to sort of breathe into the other, the thing that you're hoping to accomplish, because you want them to want it as much as you do.
Mhm. And you want the like person who's following in the dance. You want both their will and their body. Like will manifest in body to be with you through that dance. That's where it becomes really beautiful.
Mm-hmm.
So natural horsemanship.
So natural. So, okay, but let me make sure that we're tracking you here. So when you think about what's the goal when you work with horses, it seems to me that you're saying you want to get to the point where you and the horse are trying for the same thing,
Yes.
right? And if that's jumping over a log, or if that's cutting a cow from a herd, or whatever the case may be, that's when true horsemanship happens. Yeah.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah, and I think that's an important distinction. You know, I think a lot of times when we think like, oh, introductory course, like I just need to kind of like get the basic skills of riding. Like, how do I groom this horse? How do I saddle it? How do I get on it?
Hmm.
How do I turn it left? How do I stop it? Right? You're kind of asking for the thing that you're used to asking for. How do I operate this thing? What's the formula? Okay, like I got to do it.
Right.
And
Kick to
like,
make it go, pull the reins to make it stop, you know?
right. And in that scenario, like maybe without meaning to, you're sort of like your telos or your goal is perfect obedience of that horse. And like that's what makes it a good horse.
Mm-hmm.
But horses are like they don't understand the world like a tool would understand the world.
Sure.
Right? They understand the world in terms of relationship primarily.
Okay.
And that the way they understand relationship is informed by, okay, what's the nature of a horse? How does a horse operate in its own world? Well, the horse is a prey animal and it's a herd animal. And those I think are the like two main defining things you have to understand about the mode a horse understands the world, right? So prey animal, obviously it's the one that gets eaten, not the one that eats. But it means that the horse is going to Horses have basically the same brain structure that we do. They just have a way, way larger brainstem, right? So your fight or flight reaction center of your brain. They also have what would be equivalent to our neocortex. You could call it the same thing. That's like the thinking, decision-making part of your brain.
And that is bigger than what's in a cow? Like, is it's distinct, distinctly different?
Yes.
Okay.
But also, like in comparison to our brains, right? They have way more invested in the fight or flight part of their brain, and the neocortex decision-making piece is much, much smaller than ours, right? I'm not making any kind of equivalency argument between horses and humans.
Right.
So people who have experienced a lot of trauma, and actually like your brain formation begins in utero. So if your mother's experiencing a great deal of trauma, your brain will invest a lot of neurological development in your brainstem. Because if you're born into a war zone, your body, you had better be good at fight or flight, at quick reactions in order to be able to survive. So the brain of a horse is kind of like more like the brain of somebody who's experienced
Like
a lot
a
of trauma. Because
Okay.
you're not going to invest neurons in your fighter, in your the rational thinking part of your brain. You're going to invest it in that piece of your brainstem. So it means like for a horse, right? They're a prey animal. So the cost of underreacting much higher than the cost of overreacting. So if I underreact when I'm in duress, I might die, get eaten. If I overreact when I'm in duress, I might like run over there and like pant a little bit, but I lived, so like whatever. So horses have sort of like innate fear, right? You've kind of probably seen that being around horses a little bit. And that's a piece of how they think about the world, really important for being able to work with them effectively, because how do they sort of manage or deal with that fear as a prey animal? Well, they deal with it in the context of a herd, right? Horses move together in groups. So, okay, yeah, strength in numbers. But like what else is your understanding from, like, you mentioned a little bit about you're supposed to be like the dominant horse in the Pirelli framework.
Oh, and the natural horsemanship thing. Um, I do remember, and I think there was wisdom in this, that there seemed to be a emphasis on the horse acting as it would in like a day in the pasture type of thing. I remember people saying like, oh, if you take your horse for a walk and it rolls and it like lies down and rolls around, right? I remember people saying that like that's a really good thing because that means the horse is relaxed. And again, I do think they're onto something here when they said there needs to be this eagerness, right? The horse needs to want to move. The horse needs to want to exercise, not in the sense of just working up a sweat, but exercise in the sense of going through the different elements of what you're training it in. So that's what comes to mind the most readily.
Yeah. Well, and sorry, yeah, I guess what I was getting at too is like there's a lot of emphasis in the natural horsemanship world of like being the dominant horse,
Yeah.
being dominant over the horse. And I think there's some truth in that. But the way the horse deals with its situation as a prey animal is inside the herd, and in a herd, there is hierarchy. So in a wild herd, there will typically be a stallion and like a lead mare. And then you kind of have like usually like all the mares underneath that, and then like the young horses, like some of them, like when they get old enough, the bachelor stallions have to go off and find their own crew. But within that hierarchy, you have one horse who is like the lead stallion. And like, so what defines life for the lead stallion? Like what's his job in life?
I mean, the way it was always explained to me was vigilance, right? Like you are the first line of defense against predators, and you have perhaps the privilege of being maybe the dominant mating partner, but there also comes the responsibility of you're also the first in line when danger comes over the horizon.
Yeah. So, right, you get first pick of food, first pick of the mares, But you carry all of this responsibility for your herd
Mm-hmm.
for danger.
Mm-hmm.
So you say, like, okay, I have this 1,000 pound animal. I want it to do what I want. I want it to follow where I lead,
Yep.
and I want its will to be united to mine.
Okay.
So what's the template for that in a herd? Is like, okay, who is this horse following in the herd? It's following the lead horse in the herd, who's making the decision about when danger comes, but it's also directing the feet of the other horse. It's definitely telling that horse where to go. So the idea in natural horsemanship, well, first of all, also I will say, because it's worth mentioning, horses do not understand equal relationships. Like oh, we'll kind of make decisions together, like you and me, we'll like kind of hash it out, and I like this sometimes and you like that sometimes,
We'll discuss it.
and we'll discuss it. Horses do not think that way. That is non-analogous to the way that they live in their world.
Okay.
Um,
Everybody's up or down
yeah.
in their world.
But when we think up or down, and I think this really gets into like, when we think up or down, we tend to think in a Machiavellian framework, I think. Is like, either if you're in a position of power, it means you're winning
And
and
I'm
I'm losing.
losing. That makes sense.
Do you guys relate to that idea at least?
Yeah.
Right? We live
yeah.
in a really
Sure.
deeply democratic, egalitarian society. And we kind of have this idea that, like, if I make you do what my will is, like, yay, I win, but I also am sort of like assuming some kind of like role of power.
Yeah.
So I would say, like, this is one of the things that horses have to offer us, is sort of the redemption of our understanding of authority. Because in a herd setting, you have that horse who's going to tell you what to do, and it's going to be very clear in its body language, right? Horses will bite and kick at each other if they need to, in order to set and maintain that hierarchy. But that hierarchy is also tied up in being vigilant for one another's protection and like experiencing this peaceful life of companionship together. And so when we enter into relationship with that horse, you can get okay, you've got a big animal. It's not easy to get 1,000 pound animal to do what you want, right? But you can't, and so you can motivate it by fear pretty easily. And like, horses are prey animals, so they will move according to fear if they need to. Of course, that only goes so far, because once you're no longer the scariest thing in the room, then like your system's kind of gone out the window.
Okay. So it's a shortcut, but with limited results.
Yeah, I would say a lot of people in the horse world get a fair amount done through the use of fear. And I think that's really because, I'm sorry, I don't need to like dig into that too much, but like, I think that's really because we as human beings have been really formed and sort of damaged by technology. And so we're like, okay, well, this thing, I need to get this thing to do what I want. I need to operate it. How am I going to do it? Sometimes I'm just going to resort to intimidation and fear. And because the horse is a prey animal, like that can be effective to a certain degree.
Interesting. But if you're not doing that,
so if you're not doing that, you actually have to assume the role of protector for the common good.
okay.
So you have to understand, well, what is good for my horse? What is like fair for me to ask of this horse? Like, what does this horse like to do? Right? I'm not going to take like a Shetland pony and make it be my like whatever cow horse. That's kind of a goofy example, but like you assume the role of responsibility for the common good. And then you have to exercise authority, because if you don't exercise authority and your horse is calling the shots, you ever been in that position? Yeah, right? Yeah. It's not a great position to be in. And the horse will revert to like its much more sort of like animal instinct behaviors if it feels like I'm responsible for protection. And this is like being a horse person for as long as I have, I can't even tell you the amount of stories that I have like heard from people being like, oh yeah, horses, like I went on a trail ride once and like the horse ran away with me and I fell off and it was terrible.
And
I
I was
always-
traumatized.
Yeah. And it's always like, it's so painful because in those scenarios, it's like, yeah, that like it's dude riding, which is what those people are referring to, trail riding, like are sort of like common American, like dip into like horses. If you're not like already in the horse world, is like the value of a dude horse is its ability to ignore input from its rider. Right.
You
Like,
want something
not
that's as
horsemanship.
callous as possible. Yeah.
Not callous. I wouldn't even say callous. I would say as dull as possible. Of like, and as tolerant as possible.
Hmm.
If somebody was speaking Chinese to you all the time, every single day, and you did not, understand Mandarin, what's your response going to be?
Eventually, you'd probably tune it out. If you weren't actively learning it, you would actively tune it out.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Or maybe you'd be like, shut up. I can't handle it. Stop.
Yeah. Huh.
And that's the horse's position in that scenario.
Hmm.
And sorry to get off track on that.
No. This is interesting. So you're saying that if the horse does not see you as being in the is alpha the wrong word? Does that sort of tie too much into like this power and dominance structure? What's a better word? The caretaker of the common good, right? If the horse doesn't see you as being taking care of that for them, they will assume they have to take care of it for themselves,
Yeah.
which leads to a lot of accidents and mishaps.
Yeah, so if you think about it as like for us, it's either we're exercising domination or we're exercising dominion.
Mm-hmm.
And for the horse could be sort of like dominated by a predator. I'm a lion, I'm going to run at you and you're definitely going to run the
Right.
other way.
Yep.
In a herd, they're going to experience the authority of the lead horse, but that lead horse is really on their side in a very meaningful way.
Okay. Yep.
That like that horse is going to lead me to water. That horse is going to lead me to food. That horse is going to fight an attacker or take us away from danger. It's going to make all the hard decisions. I am going to give over my will to that horse because it's.
But in return, I am getting something back and something very valuable back. Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so, right, the way that horses communicate, right, I think has also analogies to the way we communicate. Have you guys ever heard of the 738-55 rule?
No.
So Albert Mehrabian did this study a ways back, and he said that human beings communicate. There are three sort of primary modes of communication. Could you guess what they are? Oh, sorry. So
like words, looks, and body language, something like that.
Yeah. So he said body language, tone, so like tone of voice, and language, and like words, language.
Yeah.
So he said in humor and interaction that like your body language carries 55% importance, your tone carries 38, and your language carries 7%.
Okay. Yeah.
So I mean, like being at a liberal arts institution, I think that language is deeply important. But I also, I think the point there is like when your body language in your tone and your words don't match, then it's like, okay, like I'm definitely going to believe your body language. I'm not going to believe the like words that you're saying.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
That does. All right. Right. We never say, oh, he said this, so I'm going to ignore his posture.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. He's probably fine. He said he was fine.
Right. Right. He was curled up in the fetal position and whimpering, but he said, I'm fine and I feel good. So
it's probably okay.
It's probably okay.
It's probably good. So setting that aside, so we think about, okay, our language, how are we going to speak to one another? And like, we work on that piece. Right. We form our minds, we educate ourselves, we cultivate our intellect. Like that's a major part of our formation.
Yeah.
do we cultivate the other pieces of our communication? Is that sort of like
Mm.
happening within community? How are we forming ourselves in those ways? Like we actually kind of acknowledge like those are really important pieces of our communication.
Mhm.
Once you have small children, you realize like, wow, these are really important pieces of my communication.
Right. My tone says a lot. Right.
Yeah.
My tone is the difference between I better get my hiney in bed or
Right.
I bet I could stay up a little longer. Right.
Like kids are really good at telling
Yeah.
the difference.
Right. Sounded like she was distracted when we said go brush your teeth. So I could get away with it.
Yeah. So horses, right? Obviously, they don't have language, but they are communicating with each other with this sort of like body language. And I would say, like the body language, you've probably being around horses. You know, they're very subtle, and then they can be very, very loud. So like the tip of an ear, a look, that means a lot in a horse herd.
Yep.
But then like you get the more obvious stuff, like the biting and the kicking, and
Yeah.
that's real consequences. You got to really deal with that. But the other piece they have is sort of like analogous to our tone, where they have sort of the energy behind which they direct their intentions towards the other horses. Sorry, I didn't say that very well. So, right, it's not just their body language alone that's important. It's not just their posture. It's like how they move and what that intention behind that movement is. So I point that out mainly because I think like horses are really good at reading our body language and tone and saying like, this may be what you think you're saying,
Okay.
but like, this is what I understand from what you're saying.
And humans typically make mistakes in the area of body language when it comes to horses.
I would say horses just give you a window into awareness of what your body is saying.
Okay.
And I think like, do we have very many opportunities to get windows into that in the rest of our lives?
Dating, kind of.
Yeah, so definitely interpersonally.
Yeah.
But then do we kind of like, do we have situations where we really work on that? It's like, okay, I think I'm like socially successful.
Right. Right.
Where do I go to like a socially successful like workshop?
Yep. Yep. Yes. No, we don't practice it in Western culture so far as I'm aware. I think in Eastern culture, it is practiced, right? Postures are practiced. Right? Leaning forward, where to place your hands, how to attend to someone who's a superior. I think in Eastern cultures, those are specifically like drilled. I'm not 100% sure about that, but certainly in Western culture, we don't practice postures the way one might have practiced penmanship back in the day.
Yeah. And again, I kind of like want to go back to like, right, this is a big piece of our normal lives that was like normal for most of human history that's been removed. So like, okay, were we kind of like getting like a school for good relationships kind of on this very simple level all the time in our kind of our like daily lives, daily interactions with animals? And that doesn't mean that human beings were then learning from it and being virtuous as a result, right? You have like the stories from all kinds of literature of like the people like beating their horses, etc. So I'm not saying it's like any kind of guarantee of virtue, but right, it's much easier. It's like you don't have to like face your soul if you like, you know, beat on your car or push the gas pedal. Like nobody's suffering as a result of that.
Right.
But your animal is suffering if you're being cruel to it.
Yep.
So I think there's just a real way in which, and if you're really going to have that meaningful goal-oriented relationship with a horse, you have to practice the 4 cardinal virtues. You have to be prudential, right? Because again, like this isn't a formula. I have to know my animal. I have to exercise justice, both because I have to assume the role in this relationship. It's very important for me too. But I have to exercise justice towards my horse of being able to ask it the thing that I needed to do and then say, thank you, you did that thing for me. I certainly have to exercise fortitude and temperance in the mode that I communicate with the horse, because right, a horse is strong, powerful. It's the will of its own. It has resistance. So you have to like be able to persevere. But you also have to be temperate, because if you are too forceful with a horse, you can push it into like prey animal brain. Anyways, that's like my like zip over like this is really great because you get to exercise all the virtues. But you kind of get this like sort of foundational template for what does a good relationship look like? And what does exercising authority look like? Rightly ordered authority look like? I have to assume the role of guide in this relationship. I don't have a choice. I could maybe pretend in a or maybe in a relationship like a friendship, I won't necessarily have to go there. But then when I have children, oh, I am gonna really have to make decisions about like how to discipline them, how to guide them. Like I can't abdicate that role and pretend we're in an equal relationship. Or I mean, people actually are trying to do that.
People
So
do try to do that.
people
That's
do
one
try to
of
do
the
that.
most common trends in my parents' part of the country.
I think it's a very wide trend. And I guess what I'm arguing is that it comes out of the notion that authority means my power over you means that if I'm directing you, I'm winning and you're losing. Well, I don't want you to lose because you're my kid and I love you.
Yep.
So I actually just won't exercise power over you. Also because happiness comes from like doing what you like, not doing
Sure.
necessarily what's good for you. So that's like a whole nother piece.
Okay, so it's the very real absorption of the idea that power corrupts. So to have power is corrupting. And so if I exercise power over children, that means, well, if I'm exercising power, that means I must have power. And so that's a corrupting influence on me. So I need to co-parent my child with my child,
I
right?
think that's what a lot of people are trying to
Right.
do.
My child is a partner in how they're raised.
Yeah.
Like, no, they're profoundly selfish little creatures.
Well, and I think it's sort of assuming like they're just little adults.
Mm.
It's like actually a lack of understanding of what a child is and what they need from the world. And you kind of like with a horse, you're like, oh, and then that's right. I will say there are people in the horse world that are trying to do the same thing
Oh,
of like, oh, I don't ride my horses and like everything is consent based. Like I ask my horse if I can get on it, but if it doesn't want to get on, it's like not going to come to the mounting block. So like, they're trying to do the same thing.
okay.
They're trying to eliminate authority
And
because
leadership, basically.
yeah, because leadership just means I call the shots and you have to do what I say. Like that's the understanding. And just think of like, okay, like we are disconnected from God. And like, right now, I mean, I think we live in a pagan nation. Maybe it's nicer to say post-Christian, but like I think we live in a pagan society at this point. We definitely as a society worship not God. Okay, yeah, like what are the things that we like proclaim is like pride in the way that we want to choose our lives. And we want everything to sort of or there are certain segments like want everything to be consent based and like my happiness means the manifestation of my will. I guess another piece that I haven't touched on, but since I happen to stumble into this sphere of like my body is also a tool to get me to what I want, and I can manipulate that tool in order to serve the ends of my will or my desires. And I think that's another thing that horses offer us is like a profound like you are not just an intellect inside a body. Your will and what you do in your body have to be united in doing the same thing. And that's another thing that I just think like we don't really have very many realms in which we get that. Of like, are you as an embodied being integrated in your intellect and like what you're striving for of like, I want to be patient. Am I actually being patient in my body? Like I want to have fortitude. Am I actually being like experiencing fortitude in my body?
Is my body fortifying?
Yeah.
Am I fortifying right now?
I want to be temperate. Is my body actually being temperate? Like, here's another being that's going to tell me, like, yes, you are, or no, you're not.
Okay, so this is not the everything of horsemanship, but there's a way in which a horse more quickly and and more quickly and more thoroughly mirrors the lack or presence of our own virtues.
I would say so.
Like if you're an impatient person, that is going to come out when you try to ride a horse, perhaps much more quickly than in other types of endeavors.
I would say so. And the other thing about a horse is a horse has the profound ability, because of the way it's built, to be present
Uh-huh.
in a way that I think it's much more difficult for, well, it's much more varied for human beings to be present with one another, right? We're often thinking about what happened in the past, thinking about what's going to happen in the future. Like it takes cultivation and discipline for us to really be present in the moment. For a horse, that's just like that's what I'm doing all the time. I'm like completely present to what's going on in this moment all the time. And you're saying this. And so
Yes.
I'm going to respond in kind.
Okay.
But the horse also has the profound ability, because it's not thinking past or future, of like, if you suddenly begin to exercise temperance in a way that you weren't before, it's like, oh, okay, you're going to be different now. Great, I'm going to be different too, because you just presented something really different to me. And so a horse has the ability to shift and change in a way that I think it's very much more difficult for human beings to do in sort of like perfect accord with one another, because we just have more baggage.
We're always pulling a longer trail of thoughts and experiences behind us. A horse is sort of in the moment in a way that's very difficult in human consciousness.
And so I think that just like gives you the opportunity to sort of get a distilled sort of sense of like, well, this is where I'm at, actually.
Okay. Okay, so I'm curious to what degree you would describe yourself as a practitioner of natural horsemanship.
Hmm. That's that's good. Well, I would say like I deeply believe in the notion that if I understand the nature of a horse, I understand its mode of speaking to one another, I'm going to be wildly more effective in being able to communicate with horses. I think like natural horsemanship is kind of a pretty big umbrella. A lot of different people in that world. You got your Monty Roberts, you got your Pat Pirelli, you got Tom and Bill Dorrance. You have like Brent Grafe. Like you have a lot of different people who are sort of like have their iterations of what that really looks like. And I say like, you know who the father of natural horsemanship is considered to be? Xenophon.
Xenophon. Ooh.
Okay. So like, all right, that's pretty interesting. I'll just like make a little plug here. That's pretty interesting from like a Western tradition standpoint, because who are the fathers of philosophy? Who do we consider the fathers of philosophy in the Western tradition?
Our Greeks.
Plato, Aristotle, right? Plato, Socrates, and Aristotle. So, right, Plato's a student of Socrates. So is Xenophon. Xenophon is like has this incredible formation. And then he also like in his like treatises and dialogues, Plato right ends up like writing the dialogues. He's pursuing the like true life of philosophy. Xenophon has some dialogues of his own, and sorry, writings of his own, including the art of horsemanship. And like Xenophon is a warrior. How did I get off on this?
Going. Who cares?
Right. So Xenophon is kind of maybe our example of like sort of a unity of the philosophical formation and sort of the active life, and how does that play out? And so he has this profound understanding that the pursuit of horsemanship should be for Kala, or the Kalista, the noble and the beautiful, and that's your highest goal in horsemanship. And I think like, okay, that version of natural horsemanship where it's like, I understand how the horse communicates, and my goal is not, I want this thing to submit to my will, to be obedient to me. I mean, I do want obedience. That's important. But what I want is obedience towards the unity of wills, so that we can participate in the noble and the beautiful together. Like that, I'm
The
like,
greater good of the two of us.
yeah. And like that's an Edenic version of what like a human and an animal relationship could or should be like.
Okay, so obedience is an element, and it is a necessary element, but it's not the end goal. I just want the horse to do what I want. Well, that's not all you really want. You want the horse to have the opportunity to participate in the same good as your good, but also your good is a little bit bigger than just your good. It's also the horse's good. Okay. And so when you see a really a skillfully executed relationship, the human is acting in the role of the herd leader in the sense that you're directing that horse towards the greater good in some sense. And the horse is benefiting from it, not just he's more than just a beast of burden. All right. My body's sort of here to do your bidding. It's like, no, the horse gains as well.
Yeah. Have you guys seen like Baroque paintings of horses or like Renaissance paintings of horses?
Yeah.
Okay, so what do they look like in those paintings?
Very flowy.
Super, super muscular. Have you guys noticed or taken note of what their body posture is like? They always have like one leg up.
Hmm.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, that's funny. What do horses look like in nature? Like horses are a grazing animal.
Hmm.
Head is down. So, right. So, okay, what's the sort of continuity throughout time? We use horses for transportation, but we also use them for warfare.
Uh-huh.
If you want a horse that's really dangerous, you want a horse that's, and by dangerous, I mean like your partner in warfare.
Sure.
You want it to be the most agile, the most thumotic or intrepid, the most spirited. Like, I am not afraid of battle. I'm going to run into battle with you.
Yeah.
So I think this is like kind of the other side of like the prey animal. Okay, yeah, but the horse is also a thumotic animal, a spirited animal. It has sort of like a version of courage. So how do you do that? How do you get your horse to be really, really, really agile? Well, you've got hundreds of years of writing, especially in the French and the German history of like, how do you get your horse to be the most agile and skillful war horse possible? So our contemporary iteration of that is kind of dressage now, which is very disconnected from all of the goals of what those things are. But it is pretty fascinating because in nature, horses are a grazing animal. They carry about 60% of their weight on their front end and 40% of their weight on their back end. In order for a horse to get really agile and strong, you have to teach the horse to shift its center of mass backwards to make 50% of the weight being bearing on the hind legs and 50% on the shoulders. That means your horse's hind end is going to get very, very, very muscular and its shoulders are going to lift and be free. So this horse, now that it's super, super agile, really, really dangerous, it can spin around whatever it wants. It's super ferocious. Hind legs can kick out at anybody that they want. And by developing its physical agility, you're also developing its mental acuity, right? So I talked about the horse's brain being structured in this way of like, okay, you have the neurons in the brainstem, and then you have that thinking portion. If you're interacting with the horse in a way of like making it make thinking decisions, not reactive decisions, like, okay, I'm going to beat on my horse to get it to go. Okay, well, I'm definitely going to get it to go. I'm probably going to help it invest neurons in the brainstem, not the like thinking piece. So if I'm actually interacting with my horse in a way that is good for the horse's brain and good for the horse's body, I'm able to, right, manifest this horse in a more noble, more beautiful, like more intelligent way than the horse would exist in nature.
It's sort of, you've set the horse free.
Yeah. And you think like, was that the vision for like, is that what we lost in the fall? Or I don't know, it's like, and is striving for that restoration. Certainly imperfect, but
Whoa.
all right, make drop. That's it.
Yeah, exactly. Let's take a quick break. Yeah.
Right off
So
the-
what haven't we covered? Chickens. We haven't covered the
We
chickens.
haven't covered the chickens. Well, chickens, I will say, are like the highest reward for the lowest like input
Investment.
investment. Yeah. Chickens are like, well, I don't know. They're very dumb. They're not intelligent animals. But they're like pretty resilient. You know, it's like you just like give them food and water and like a space to go. And you do have to protect them from predators because if something wants to eat them, like they probably will. Um,
There's
but
like
yeah,
no,
I
they
would
don't have
say,
any defense mechanisms.
do you know how old a typical egg from the grocery store is?
I've heard 6 weeks.
Yeah.
Is that about right?
45 days.
45 days.
Yeah.
Oh.
I was probably right. Right. 1.5 months. Um, and like, right, anytime things, well, not anytime things age, sometimes when things age, they get more nutrient dense. Um, like cheeses,
Hmm.
like aged Parmesan cheddar.
Yeah.
I don't know. Um, but yeah, so I think that was also like, oh, 45 days old. And also like if you crack open a fresh egg versus cracking open like an egg from the store, like there's a very, very marked notable difference. And now I'm totally spoiled with eggs because I'm used to having our own.
I was forced
It's very much a gateway drug.
the eggs.
Yes, the
Yeah.
eggs. Of like, oh, chickens are not that hard.
It's like the gateway to the
And,
Maha.
like it's like way better than like that. So like, yeah, I'm gonna do this.
Right.
I'm like, okay, well, it costs more. Like now you're like, oh, I definitely winning financially on the egg game. It's like,
Yeah.
no, and like when you have young children, like you waste so much food. It's very painful. I have like a psychological problem with waste. I cannot handle like throwing food in the trash can is like painful to me.
Mhm.
So for me, it's also very satisfying and like therapeutic to be able to feed those things to my
The
chickens.
waste back to the chickens.
Yeah, and they eat like anything, almost. They
Including their own eggs, I've
oh yes,
noticed.
yes, that is a real possibility with chickens. But if you feed them well, like that's like a weird. That is like a. It's not like
It's
a
an
normal
aberration.
behavior.
Okay.
Yeah, that's probably means like you're either like not giving them food and water regularly, and then like one day they like they're going in to lay their egg and they like step on one and they're like ah.
Yeah.
But it is kind of creepy because I have seen that before of like a cracked egg and they all go berserk and they like eat it and you're like
Yeah.
"Oh,
It's like something out of a horror movie.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
And if you throw chicken to your like chicken bones to your chickens, they also go psycho and love that. So that's also creepy.
Bunch of natural cannibals.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah. Not elevated, but they are a gateway drug because then you're like, ooh, I can take over this piece of my food system. What else can I do?
Right. Right.
Next up is the cow.
Yeah. Pretty soon you're out there 4 a.m, milking your own cow.
Yeah.
Again,
I
I can't ever go on
I have a
vacation.
sweet deal on that because so I'm friends with, do you know Kathy
Mossberger?
Yeah.
Oh, I love Kathy.
She's so fabulous. So I would milk for her once a week when her cows are in milk, which is so great because like being close to that is like one, you have a great reverence for the amount. Like I'm already like a large animal person. I know like horses are not like I'm gonna get a dog. I'm gonna get a horse. Like no, like there's a lot more involved in taking care of a large animal. And I kind of knew that, but like dairy cows are like they're like cream of the crop, top of that notch when it comes to like maintenance and wisdom and knowledge. It's like it's not like, oh, I have a milk cow. A cow's just like I'm gonna milk in perpetuity. It's like, no, I'm a milk cow. I have to watch out for the signs of like, is this milk cow sick? Is it doing well? I have to make sure what I'm feeding it is good because what I feed it is literally what
I drink.
I drink. And it's like, okay, I also have to like be aware of like how long it's possible to have the cow in milk, and then I have to dry the cow off. Then I have to think about its breeding cycles. It's very, very complicated. And Kathy is so fabulous. So I like love hanging out with her and love like, milking her cows. So I think like maybe I would get a milk cow when my kids are like teenagers and they can like really meaningfully help.
Right.
But for now, I want to piggyback on Kathy's operation. So it's a good deal.
That is ideal.
That is ideal.
That is.
Or when I can't, I will just like pay like whatever you want me to pay for raw milk. Like I'm just gonna pay that, like whatever.
The first time I had raw milk, I thought I had died and gone to heaven. I thought it's lightly sweet. The balance is totally different. It's got this really satisfying, is weight the right word? Yeah, it's satisfying to drink it. It was great. Yeah, and I had this sweet deal too because I worked for this organic dairy farmer, and all I had to do, he was a bachelor, so he like never stopped for meals. So my mom would just make him a sandwich. I would bring the sandwich with me to work, put it in the fridge, and then we could get as much raw organic milk as we pleased. It was the best.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
That is a good deal.
That was a great deal. Yeah.
That is a great deal.
Sandwiches for gallons. Yeah.
Oh my gosh.
Gallons upon gallons. Yeah. It was great. So, yeah, how many thousands of gallons of milk did we drink just in exchange for some peanut butter and jelly?
That's incredible. That is really incredible.
Yeah. Mhm.
Well, I think one of the things that I think also like spurred me sort of along the road of like, oh, I want to like kind of take control of my food system is also like, um, in have you guys heard of the term greenwashing?
Yes.
Yeah, do you know what it is?
No.
Greenwashing is when you produce food conventionally or like almost conventionally, and you try to make it sound like you're like giving animals a great life and then producing food. So like
Like
one,
cage free eggs.
yes, yeah. So like your first benchmark in like your chickens being like living in a better life is like them being able to see sunlight. And I thought like when I was like that is how low the bar is, right? That is disturbing and astonishing.
Right.
And we're just like totally fine with like, I like it the way Joel Salatin puts it, of like an animal should be able to express instinctive behavior. Of like chickens should be able to peck, hogs should be able to root, like cows should be able to graze. Like it's very disturbing when like our food system is geared towards like, well, the only way we can feed the people is if we stick the eggs in a cage under these sort of like horrible stressful conditions, and we think like, oh, and like it's gonna be fine if we eat the eggs from those chickens because like whatever, they're just chickens. Like
The
it's
nutrients
just
are all
like
the same.
it's yeah. Or I'm not even gonna pretend to look at that because it's just not that important. Like it's only now when people are saying like, hey, wait a minute, mine actually this is way healthier. It's got like more nutrients in it. That's not something that like FDA has looked at.
Uh,
They don't want to ask those
they want to.
questions. And so the focus is like on like let's produce as much food as possible for as cheap as possible and gear the system towards like large scale production. And right, the argument, many times is like, this is the only way to feed the world. Or it's like, P.S. I'll put in my plug right now for the movie Sacred Cow. If you guys have not seen it, you better write that one down.
Right, right. You've got our homework. Marjorie's not coming back on the Green Dragon unless she can say we've watched Sacred Cow.
Say you watch Sacred
We're
Cow.
gonna have to send her pictures of us on the couch.
Homework assignment.
Yeah.
Yeah. Anyway, so there's a whole nother side of that which sort of addresses in that film of like all of the like production land that we have, like available production land. A lot of it is not actually farmable to grains, to farm it with animals. But like, again, when you think of like, okay, if we looking back through human history of like creation, like, we did not have the luxury or ability to monocrop huge amounts of corn and soy or wheat, and then, right, but in order to protect those, we have to like drench them with pesticides, GMO them so that they're resistant to it. We always had like a system, a loop, right? So where like
I was in Belize in January, and I spent the day with a farmer who also teaches agriculture at a college nearby, and he said the single greatest lesson that basically informs all of his curriculum is he wants his students to know that there is a natural cycle to the growing season that does not require specific agricultural products to be inserted at every stage. And in fact, it doesn't require it be inserted at any stage. And he said if he can give the students that sense, then he knows that they'll be able to go on and practice agriculture independently because they're not going to be essentially victims to the agricultural sales hegemony.
Wild.
Isn't that wild? That was his one goal.
That's very cool.
I mean, he taught classes with more details than that, but yeah.
That's
But
fascinating.
that was his paradigm.
Yeah. Well, so have you guys heard of Alan Savory? He's a little bit of a controversial figure.
I have heard that name.
So he like spearheaded like murdering elephants like in I don't know, maybe the 70s. So he kind of like destroyed his own reputation. He's now, so he's like a little bit of an extreme figure. He's now restoring grasslands in Africa just by using grazing animals. So when we think like, oh, animals graze the grass, they like eat it down, and then you got to like move them onto new land. Like you don't think like, oh, the grazing is good for the land, because that's certainly not the model that I ever saw. So, and typically when you're like carrying like have horses, you have paddocks for turnout, and then you have your hay fields. And your horses probably never go on the hay field. Maybe they go on the hay field after you cut at the end of the season, but you never let them out there earlier. But you don't think of grazing animals actually being good for the land. Or I don't know, maybe you guys do. I certainly didn't think about it that way. But when you think about like, this is interesting. Wendell Berry talks about this. And he talks about how like the conservation movement in America thinks about nature as a television of like, no, I want to conserve nature. So I'm going to buy that plot of land and then I'm going to like, just like, don't touch it.
Don't touch it.
Don't touch it. That's like land. It's good now.
Hmm.
I'm conserving it.
Right.
But land isn't really like that. Because okay, then you have land that's being left alone. Well, that's not actually like how land is in like what do you mean? What do you mean in nature when you say that? Because well, usually in truly in nature, there's biodiversity, and there are animals that are grazing on that, and then probably there are predators that are killing those animals, that killing the grazers so that it doesn't get overgrazed. Right in the plains, like your buffalo were grazing on the land, but they were also moving over the land because they were getting pushed by the wolves.
Yep.
So they're not sitting in one place eating it down. And this is one of the like very basic practices of regenerative farming is rotational grazing. I don't remember how I got here, but I guess sort of thinking of like sort of having like a new framework of like, oh, actually like God was wise, creation has a good system. And it's when things are working in harmony in unison that like, okay, the cows move over the grass, it stimulates the roots. Like eating the grass down stimulates better growth. Them pooping on it is like giving it fertilizer. And then they move on and they go to a next patch of land. Actually being on the land can be good. Does that mean we aren't actually just parasites?
Right.
Like it comes down to right. We talked about dominion and stewardship, like wise stewardship. If it's good for us, if it's a good thing simply, it should probably also be good for creation. Like it doesn't make sense, hopefully. It doesn't make sense to me that it should be a I win, you lose relationship.
And it would seem to be that what we're discovering that the practices which conservationists might most strenuously object to, right? The factorization of the food supply, the emphasis of producing calories with not nutrients, calories at the lowest possible cost per calorie, all of these things which conservationists may rightly object to are actually neither of those things good for the human population, which is supposedly living off of it, right? So perhaps there are conservationists who make the mistake of thinking, oh, because humans do these things, we're parasites. It's like, no, those things, like, well, maybe we're acting like parasites, but parasites that are actively killing themselves, right? Like if we were to behave in the way that would actually lead to our thriving, we would not be parasites. We would be in a more symbiotic state with nature. So yes, we're not even parasites. When at our worst, we are something worse, which is like suicidal in our agricultural practices. Right.
One of the things that Casey Means said in that interview was that like we are oh gosh, what did she say? Not we're pro-death. But she said kind of something. Oh, no, I'm just gonna kick myself until that kicks in. But it was something I'd only ever heard from like the pro-life movement.
Okay.
And I was like, wait a minute. Oh, she said we're a culture of death.
Oh,
And I thought like, whoa, you just totally blew my mind. Because I always think of that, of course, in the context of abortion. She was talking about it like, we don't even care that we're feeding ourselves poisons.
Right.
it's crazy.
We've given up. Like we're in this like deep spiritual crisis. And for me, of course, that's like a moment of like unity between these like two sort of like politically disparate topics that I think are really actually very united in this. Like, do we subjugate nature to our own ends?
Uh-huh.
Or are we docile to the movements of nature? And like understand that like sometimes things are not going to go the way that we want them to, and we're going to have to like suffer hard consequences. Because like we do live in a fallen world. So like maybe we're not always going to farm perfectly.
Yep.
And like maybe not every child is going to be desired, but we still should bring them into the world. That was really astonishing to me.
You remind me of, so my dad went to U of I, University of Illinois, and he had a professor there named Julian Simon, and this guy was a huge anti-populationist actually. And one day he was going to a meeting and he realized, wait a minute, I should be the first one to go. And so he starts looking into all the research and the facts and data about everything. He's like, are we actually the problem? Or is there too many people on the planet? He did a complete 180 and then became one of the biggest advocates for more population in the world. And he wrote this book called The Ultimate Resource. And in that book, he showed with data that the more people there are, the more we have to use with everything. Finite resources are actually infinite resources by the data. So he said, like, when copper gets expensive, he's like, would you like to know that we only use 1.01% of the copper mines we know of? He says, would you also like to know that in 1970, the world could handle 100 billion people? That was 60 years ago. He's like, we're not even on the brink of what the earth can do for us. He's like, we have as many resources as we want. He's like, there's no limit here. And so he became a huge like proponent for like
a pro-natalist.
Yeah.
Wow.
Just crazy. So it's so good because it puts all of those things like those dire like, oh, we have too many people, we're running out of things. It's like, no, God gave us a world of abundance and there is no cap, which is really cool.
Have you guys heard of the book Hannah's Children by Catherine Pacolic? So she talks about this in the beginning of her book as well. Sort of like we bought into this notion of overpopulation based on a few of these people, right, the scientists and like pretty influential papers back in that era of the 60s and 70s. But she said what we later realized, what we did not calculate, is that with like we said like, well, here are, like here's like graph of like what we have and like here's how we're producing. So this is like the factor that we did not consider was human ingenuity. And that like at every turn we've seen that like uptick, like meeting in beyond what the resources are. So I won't try to quote any more than that because I don't remember as well as I should.
Well, yeah.
But it's the same idea. And now we have all these like, yeah, Hannah's Children.
Okay.
The women defying the birth dearth. So it's that book is really interesting because it is talking about like the value of big families and what that gives. But she begins it, so she's an economist by trade, and so she talks also just kind of about like this is the frame, this is sort of like the academic framework for beginning this sort of like idea of overpopulation. And like, that actually is, yeah, a fallacious framework, a total fallacy.
Like here's something really cool. There's a farmer that developed his own car panels made out of soybeans that are stronger than steel.
What?
So,
And he uses them.
All right, where are my notes? I gotta get this guy's
Yeah.
name.
I forget his
The
name.
panels on a car
Yeah, so he built his own Mustang with soybean parts,
with.
like on like the shell, like all those
Oh.
like his
Gotcha.
doors and quarter panels and hood and everything.
Interesting. The soy stang.
That's an awesome name.
Huh.
Yeah, and so he
And what part of the soybean he was using, like the fibers of the leaves or the soybeans themselves, or did you?
I don't remember.
Really curious.
I'll have to look it up.
Yeah.
But he was in
Put it in the show notes. How did they build the soy stang?
the soy stang, yeah.
That's gonna be my legacy, the soy stang. No way, take that off.
Yeah.
We're talking about so many good things.
Right. What did that become the name of the episode? Racing the soy stang. Yeah.
I'll have to find it, but he was driving it in a test run and they hit the aerodynamic wall, so the car flipped and it like rolled a few times, and then all the metal parts were really crumpled and his soybean parts were just like slightly dented.
Whoa. Was he slightly dented or?
How did he do
There's
that?
someone
Yeah.
else driving the car.
Like, I believe in my work.
But I'm gonna get my stunt man.
Yeah, exactly. Oh, Marjorie, thank you so much for joining us. I understand that we're out of time. Unfortunately, I really do feel like we've only scratched the surface on at least 3 of the topics we got to, but at least we were able to dive into horses a little bit past the surface. But I do hope you'll come back and join us again soon on the podcast.
Thank you for having me. I'll consider you for
Whoa! Among her many invitations to the, among her many invitations.
It'll be a pleasure to review.
Yeah, we may be able to garner another visit.
Maybe
So-
maybe one day we can have Pablos and I on as like a
That'd be fun.
dynamic duo.
That would be fun. All right.
Thank you for
We'll have to
having
branch out into the Green Dragon babysitting.
Yeah.
Yeah. Figure it out.
We'll figure it out. So,
Right,
well, good.
thanks, guys.